Brussell in Carmel, California. This is Friday, January the 5th, 1979, and this is tape number 370, side 1. This tape today is going to be about the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and particularly the difference between myself and the other researchers, the researchers from the Assassination Information Bureau in Washington, and the various researchers that they interviewed after the House Select Committee finished their hearings. Before I get into the particular researchers and the difference between my work and theirs, I do want to make a comment about Richardson Pryor, the drug king from the House Select Committee, the multi-millionaire representative from the Sterling Drug Company, the maker of flu vaccine for Gerald Ford and thalidomide for newborn babies. Richardson Pryor was the spokesman for the House Select Committee. I guess they used him as the mouthpiece when they completed their work because he's the judge, and here comes the judge who would question the judge, Richardson Pryor. And he had a press conference. UPI covered the story, and he made several comments that I would like to answer to. He said the Justice Department should pay particular attention to the anti-Castro Cubans and the crime syndicate members, that if they follow up in any leads the House Committee had, this is the area to look at. And he said if they follow the investigation of the murder of President Kennedy, they should go into those areas. Now, we already know from Senator Church's investigation that the organized crime members get immunity from the Justice Department. The Justice Department has given immunity to Lucky Luciano until his death from 1923. Until his death, he was immune from prosecutions. He went to jail for a short time and then was released to go to Italy to become the narcotics chief and responsible for a large deal of the heroin and serious drugs that came into this country after he was deported. The Justice Department has given favors to chemical companies such as IG Farben and various Nazi organizations, and they have worked hand in hand with murders such as the Kent State and the Orangeburg Massacre and various areas that we researchers have had to break into. They've covered up layers and layers of information and hard facts. So it's a contradiction to think that the Justice Department would look into the crime syndicate at this point, or the anti-Castro Cubans, when both members of those branches are incorporated into the Central Intelligence Agency and therefore, for security reasons, can never be investigated. The biggest smokescreen, of course, of the entire investigation that I've said all along are the links to Walter Dornberger, Albert Osborne, George de Mohrenschildt, John Connolly, the Nazi connections. Richardson Pryor said the committee didn't find a scintilla of evidence linking the Secret Service, the CIA, or the FBI to a conspiracy, and we also believe the anti-Castro Cubans and the National Syndicate of Organized Crime were not involved. On the one hand, he says, go into the Justice Department and look into the Cubans and the syndicate, but he wants to narrow it down to a few individuals and not large groups of people with collusion of the federal government. The committee didn't find any evidence of Secret Service, FBI, or CIA conspiracy, according to Richardson Pryor, but on the other hand, the staff was selected entirely by the CIA and FBI, and they approved of every person who testified and everybody who worked for them. G. Robert Blakey was the common denominator between the CIA, the FBI, the Justice Department, and organized crime, and he kept a staff that eliminated making the connections. It's true they didn't find the evidence, but they kept it out. They didn't call Robert Mayhew as a witness, even though he set up assassination teams and was the bonding between the CIA and organized crime in 1960. It was going on much longer with Thomas Dewey and the New York Mafia organized crime members, but in 1960 the big assassination teams got formed when Mayhew met in New York City and combined these people for the series or the era of assassinations that we're feeling right now. Richardson Pryor said our committee does not preclude that individual members of organized crime or anti-Castro Cubans were involved. And again, I give you the layers of the cover-up. Richardson Pryor, the House Select Committee, and the people I'm going to refer to in the rest of this tape are the next layer of cover-up. They differ totally from Mae Brussell, from where she stands, and I think it's important for you to have this tape as these news stories break, so you have some way to gauge how far they're willing to go and how much they're holding the line. Of course, the original Warren Commission said Oswald did it alone. That was the first story. Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone, and that held for 15 years. The next story to try to cover up would be a KGB USSR Lee Harvey Oswald conspiracy, and throw in the Oswald doubles, that he was switched in Minsk, and that wasn't Oswald, it was a different person, that Russia was behind the assassination. The next line was that Fidel Castro ordered it as retaliation for wanting to kill him or invade Cuba. The fourth layer of cover-up was organized crime. Individual members of mafia and organized crime were in this avenging John Kennedy for taking over the gambling houses in Cuba, or for Robert Kennedy wanting to prosecute Jimmy Hoffa, putting him in jail, and for excommunicating Carlos Marcellos, who came back to this country, and the anti-Castro Cubans, the revenge for the Bay of Pigs. Now, those are the layers going up. That's about as far as they've gotten now. And, of course, the next area to investigate, where they leave off, that maybe will take 15 more years, and maybe it won't, maybe we don't have that much time anymore, would be the Mayhew connections to the subjects listed below, the CIA connections and the Defense Department connections and the Division 5 of the FBI to the anti-Castro Cubans, the organized crime, and so forth, and then trying to take the evidence and shift it around to make it look like the Russians and Cubans did it, and then show that Lee Harvey Oswald not only didn't do it alone, but that he didn't do it at all. That is the part that is covered up by the various researchers, and the connecting links, the links that go above what the stated intent was of Richardson prior, to say that single people from organized crime or single anti-Castro Cubans may have gone astray, and then later find that those particular ones are dead, and therefore we can't do anything, was as much as they could get out of this committee. And the various people that have been called upon to give opinions stay at the very lowest, most unsophisticated and unintelligent level, that in order that these layers continue to cover up. The cover-up went on. It started in Boston in 1975 when they had a conference there, and various researchers then began to set up. Mark Lane said his office is up in Washington, D.C., and through elimination process of one person after the other, each equally bad, they got Robert Blakey, who wrote the Senate Crime Bill number 1 for Richard Nixon, that gentleman from the Justice Department, to head this investigation. The Assassination Information Bureau that set up the hearings in Boston moved to Washington, D.C., and set up their offices during the hearings, and they got out a newsletter. I gave you the address last week, Clandestine America. And they had, after the committee hearings were over, they had interviews with 7 of the critics. They described them as 7 of the most active critics who were chosen for interviews. And, of course, I could name 6 others plus myself that could fill in these questions, and that's what I'm going to do with you now. I'm going to show you how they answered the questions of AIB and how I would have answered them. I'll give you the names of the people in case you don't have their bulletin or didn't order it. One is Jerry Polikoff. His claim to fame is writing an article on how the New York Times distorted or eliminated information on the assassination of John Kennedy. That's his expertise, is the New York Times. His understanding of history is nilch. I know Jerry Polikoff. I met him in New York. He was out here at the house on a trip once. He stayed here for about an hour or so and left. He is, I think, as a researcher, empty-headed, shallow, but he's a good mouthpiece. He's written a few articles for New Times, Rolling Stones, and he put his article in the Realist on the Warren Commission in the New York Times. The second critic they interviewed was David Lifton. David has a publisher now. He has a book coming out. He's been working on it 14 years. I know David better than all of these other researchers personally, because he helped write the first article in Ramparts on the Kennedy assassination, and I had done a section of that article. And David and I have had differences of opinion on the research. We don't see eye to eye on a lot of the material. He holds the line, definitely holds the line, with all kinds of excuses and apologies, but he did two monumental things. He did publish the book, the document addendum to the Warren Report, with the minutes of the meetings of the Warren Commission, which is one of the most valuable books in my library, or if any of you have it, you would agree that it is extremely valuable, and that is the book that tells how the Warren Commission covers up through their own words and also how they plan to cremate that body that was Lee Harvey Oswald's before they ever started the meetings. A very valuable book. And then when David was doing his work in the National Archives, he microfilmed very early hundreds of pages, it runs into the thousands for me, of information in the area that I was concerned in. He was working on the motorcade, and I was working on the White Russian community and Lee Harvey Oswald. And he got for me documents which I know later many must have been destroyed because I don't know anybody else who has them. And I got a letter from David. He'll be out here soon, and he'll come up to the house and we'll visit, and he does have a publisher. The third person that's interviewed here is Sylvia Marr. She wrote Accessories After the Fact. I've always criticized Sylvia because she did the subject index of the Warren Commission with the various people interviewed and left out every link to the Nazi connections to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, to the Young Americans for Freedom, and the conspiratorial links were cut off, and all those names were eliminated. And then she held the line that with what she did, just certain pieces of evidence and fact, which were excellent. Her book, Accessories After the Fact, is excellent. But it's like having a child learn a basic primer and then taking a test, Stanford entrance test, and expecting to get in. The very important ingredients that would divulge the whole story are eliminated. And after that point, she said, I just stopped doing work. I met her in New York, and she tells people Mae Brussell is crazy. She told me she never heard of the Torba document. I offered to give it to her. She said, I'm not doing research anymore. Yet she advised the House Select Committee. She said she may go back to doing some writing. She's retired from the United Nations now, where she worked. So she is active, but she refuses to hold the Torba document or read it or to learn anything other than to stick with the General Walker shooting or certain stories about Marina Oswald and certain details that came out very early after the assassination. She keeps reiterating those, which is all right. But it's like going up the rings of a ladder. If you want to get to the top, to change that light bulb or do whatever you're going to do, you can't stay on the second ring if it's way up high. You've simply got to go on up to get to your goal. And if you stay there too long, 15 or 20 or 30 years, then you know something is wrong. Harold Weisberg is a good researcher. He sticks with facts. He denies there was a conspiracy at Watergate. He'll tell you Dorothy Hunt wasn't working with E. Howard Hunt, that there was no conspiracy to get Nixon out. He discredits many of the researchers, such as Sherman Skolnick. He puts them down. He is very cantankerous, and right now he's under salary to the Justice Department. He was in the OSS, I believe the FBI. He's under salary of the Justice Department, and again, when you get up that ladder, I don't want to detract from his work, and I'll be specific in their answers, but in my opinion, each one of these people has been treading water instead of swimming. They've stayed at a certain place, and where they've stayed is very basic. They're not sinking, but they're not getting across, and that's the main thing, is to get the answers. Paul Hawk works for the Defense Department. He's a physicist at the Lawrence Lab up in Berkeley. He has taken on the role of a assassination investigator, and he's Defense Department all the way, in spite of the fact that he gave one answer that I do agree with in his questionnaire. I have never trusted Paul Hawk from the day that I was informed that he was keeping dossiers on me, and I called him and asked him if he ever met me, and he hadn't. Have you ever been to the house, seen the research? No, he hadn't. Then why is it your business to keep dossiers on me? He's as much of a spy as an investigator, and I didn't appreciate the fact that he works for the Defense Department and carries the cloak of the investigator and the authority with him. Bernard Fensterwald's worked with the CIA all of his life. He's been exposed over and over again as part of the CIA. He put in this House Select Committee with Robert Blakey. He was down in New Orleans at the time Jim Garrison was working, arrested Clay Shaw. He's made no major breakthrough. His book is excellent. He has a very good book, Fensterwald, called Coincidence or Conspiracy. he leaves it open, but again, we're going up the rings of the ladder, and when it's through, you have a lot of biographies about a lot of individual people, but you can't make connections of how this thing came down and who's covering it up. And then Caroll Oglesby, Penn Jones has said that he's been in the G2, the Army Intelligence, for years. He's famous for his Yankee and Cowboy War story and conspiracies from Dallas to Watergate. Caroll Oglesby and Fensterwald and Hawk and Weisberg and Marr and Lifton and Polikoff do a job only to a point, and they sat in Washington and they did meet with members of the House Select Committee, but the committee is at point zero. Maybe it's a little farther ahead than the Warren Commission, but not much more, considering it's been 15 years. The AIB, the Assassination Information Bureau, asked questions of these various researchers, now that I've given my opinion of them or background, and I'm going to run through very quickly the questions that they asked them, these answers, and then what my answer would be if they asked me to reflect on the assassination hearings. The first question is, what new evidence did the House Select Committee develop during the public hearings? Jerry Polikoff said, we saw a lot of new evidence with the way the CIA proceeded, and we saw a lot on the background of Jack Ruby. For the first time, we got medical experts to substantiate that the back wounds on JFK were lower than the autopsy report. There wasn't anything earth-shaking. If it was lost to me. David Lifton said the most important new evidence was the artist's drawing of the autopsy photographs and x-rays of John Kennedy's body. Jerry Polikoff talks about the way the CIA proceeded, but he doesn't get specific at all in how that would tell us any more about the assassination. And as far as the background of Jack Ruby, they only went into his links to organized crime and very superficially, and eliminated his links to the CIA and the FBI and specific people by name. The medical experts, as far as the wounds go, it doesn't really matter to me if the wounds are 12 inches up or 12 inches lower. If Lee Harvey Oswald didn't fire a gun, and if there were doubles in the Texas School Book Depository, I don't think it matters 15 years later exactly where the wounds were, because we don't know where the shots came from, and we don't know who shot the weapons. As I say, David Lifton thought the most important and dramatic new evidence was the artist's drawing of the autopsy photographs and x-rays, and I thought that was absolutely obscene. At this late date, we can see x-rays of John Connolly's body, but we can't see x-rays of John Kennedy's body. And at this late date, we can't see the photograph of a bullet hole in a man's head, but we can see it every day in the newspapers and on evening television, and it isn't obscene at all. So they get a third person in to draw every minute hair that cost $10,000 for the drawing. We still don't get the first person piece of evidence to see ourselves. Sylvia Marr said the acoustical evidence was the most important. Now, I'll be referring to that a lot because that was the tape of the Dallas policeman of 4 shots fired at Dealey Plaza. She said the neutron activation analysis was certainly important, although it needs thorough evaluation. The confirmation of the human figure behind the retaining wall in the Willis picture. The Nosenko story was quite shattering. The discovery that 37 documents from Oswald's CIA file were missing, and the fact that Judge Griffin doesn't believe now that Jack Ruby came in through the Main Street ramp, that he entered the Dallas jail when he killed Lee Harvey Oswald by another means. Now, as far as the acoustical evidence, she says that was the most important, and it probably was because it shows that more than one person was firing a weapon that day. The neutron activation was certainly important. I don't know what Sylvia Marr means by the neutron being important. I think it was the most disgusting single piece of evidence that I saw that was proved without any doubt a huge conspiracy, because, as I said, on tape number 358, you have that one, October 13th, 1978. I have given you the difference of the weights and bullets that were tested by this committee, and the bullets tested, the John Kennedy bullets that were tested in 78, were different than the bullets tested in 1964, and the bullets from John Connolly that were tested in 1968 were a different weight than the bullets tested in 1964. So I can't possibly imagine why the neutron activation analysis was important. The figure on the wall behind the retaining wall is a new piece of information that was made public. It was confirmed that this could be a person with a rifle. And I think that the fact that Ruby didn't come down the Main Street ramp was a very interesting thing to talk about, but then where did he come from, and why didn't they call the Dallas police in to talk about it? Now, Harold Weisberg was asked what new evidence did they develop, and he said, I don't think they did anything right. It was the American equivalent of a show trial. They took preconceptions and did what they could to make them appear reasonable. It was an updated version of the Warren report. Now, Harold Weisberg is right. His analysis is right, but by not being specific about what they did, such as the bullet fragments and so forth, we're still back with the Warren report. He doesn't give out any new information. He just says they didn't do anything right. Paul Hawk said, I think the scientific tests provided a lot of generally important new data. I want to see the final report. I thought the weight of it was quite persuasive. I don't want to give specifics yet. Mae Brussell thinks the scientific tests were crap. I think they should have called in the other experts, Fred Newcomb, who took the analysis and overlays of the pictures of Lee Harvey Oswald in the backyard holding the rifle. I think they should have duplicated those shots with the shadows coming from the back, the rifle shadows going to the back and the nose shadows going straight down. I don't think they satisfied me, at least with those tests. I don't think their bullet tests were accurate, and I think they should have been exposed for that. I think the scientific work was pathetic. They relied on the fact that bullet 399 could do all of the shots through John Kennedy and John Connally because they tested it through an animal. The same man and the same military base, the same people tested, or so-called tested, in 1978, that bullet 399 that they did in 1964. I think the scientific tests were crappy, and I think Paul Hawk is crappy, and I don't think they gave any important new data through their scientific tests. The only thing they did was to come up with the scientific test of the 4 shots, but they've known that for 15 years. They've had this tape, and they've known it for 15 years, and they waited till the last day that they were closing and presented it and said, oh, whoops, we have a conspiracy. Give it to the Justice Department. I know that there were many areas that they could have proved a conspiracy much, much earlier, so I don't think their scientific tests were persuasive. They didn't test the inside of the car. They said that they called Dearborn, Michigan, and an officer up there told them there were no bullets in the car. Well, obviously there aren't. It was written by Lyndon Johnson and Gerald Ford. But they didn't rip out those seats. They didn't take any ballistic expert to rip out the whole body of the car and look inside the metal part of the back where these bullets were supposed to have hit from them, gone into the car. The scientific evidence, as far as I'm concerned, was crap. Bernard Fensterwald said some of the testimony points clearly to at least 2 riflemen in Dealey Plaza. I thought the testimony of the audio experts as to 4 shots and groupings was the most important single piece of information. It makes believable the scenario of 2 gunmen, each firing from 2 positions, and I would suspect one came from a lower floor of the depository and the other corner of the building, which again leaves you wide open with nothing particular. Back 15 years ago, I think that by November 24th, 1963, many people said there were 2 riflemen at various positions in the school book depository and a belief that there were 2 or more gunmen. Carl Oglesby said the committee established that Oswald was in contact with Carlos Marcello mob during his stay in New Orleans in 1963 through David Ferry, and the committee acknowledged that Jack Ruby was an organized crime member. Now that goes back to what I say is the level of cover-up numbers 4 and 5 on that pyramid. If you go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and I want to get up to 6, 7, and then 8 as the very final answers. They're at organized crime and anti-Castro Cubans, which is the cutoff right there. He leaves out the fact that, sure, Lee Harvey Oswald met with David Ferry, and Ferry worked with Carlos Marcello. But David Ferry also worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. Lee Harvey Oswald met with Ferry and Marcello, but Lee Harvey Oswald also worked for the FBI and the CIA. Robert Mayu and Guy Bannister of the FBI that worked together, FBI and CIA in Chicago, split. Bannister opened an office down there in New Orleans that backed up to Lee Harvey Oswald's office, and Robert Mayu had hired the assassination teams that used organized crime in the CIA. They left out Robert Mayu, going up the ladder again to that next step. Carlos Marcello, Rosselli, Giancana, Jack Ruby also all worked for the FBI and the CIA. And Carl Oglesby says, the committee established Oswald contacted Marcello, but it does not go into the context of Lee Harvey Oswald with the Central Intelligence Agency. Albert Osborne from the Defense Intelligence Agency went down to Mexico to Lee Harvey Oswald. A man named Osborne picked up the the pro-Castro Cuban pamphlets that Lee Harvey Oswald was passing out, and the FBI man was called to release him when he was arrested that night. All he did was call the FBI and get out of jail. The committee did not go into the FBI man who was called to release Lee Harvey Oswald, or Ferry's CIA connections, or Robert Mayu and Guy Bannister and Lee Harvey Oswald's FBI and CIA connections. And they leave out the fact that Jack Ruby was with Connie Trammell of the CIA, of the Republic National Bank, that did killing for the CIA with black bag, black money. They leave out Jack Ruby's connections to H.L. Hunt, the oil people, the Central Intelligence Agency, Jack Ruby's connections to Earlene Roberts, the woman who ran the rooming house where Lee Harvey Oswald stayed. It was her sister Bertha Cheek who was giving Ruby a large sum of money, I believe it was $17,000, 3 weeks before the assassinations, and Jack Ruby's connections to Warren Caroll of the CIA. Carl Oglesby comes through and the AIB come through in their interviews because what he says was the most important evidence that they developed was that Oswald was in contact with Marcello in New Orleans through the mob and David Ferry, and that Jack Ruby worked with organized crime. And I want to repeat again, and you get up, when you go away from Oswald did it alone, to the KGB did it, to Castro did it, then the next is organized crime, and the next is anti-Castro Cuban. Then you make that big leap into the Defense Intelligence Agency, Division 5 of the FBI, then you get to the Spider, or the Nazi connections to Bormann, de Mohrenschildt, the world Nazi organizations, and then you're at the top. Incidentally, not to digress too far from this because we've got a lot of material to cover, if you saw the news this week there were two things in the news that make me think of how this assassination research is going and why Kennedy was killed and where it's leading. The news event, if you saw the streets of Beverly Hills with the riots and fires at the home of the Shah of Iran's mother, and the streets seeing the hills burning there, and then you read that General Haig is retiring from the Army and he wants to run for President of the United States, your lines are going to be clearly delineated. Either you will be fighting in the streets, or you will have General Haig, the top dog, the top Nazi dog for Kissinger and Brzezinski, as President of the United States. And you better get to that bottom line because your choices are narrowing. It's 15 years later, and if you don't make a reasonable effort to change the system and expose these people who are still covering up and take the guts to expose them, on radio talk shows, in person, write AIB, confront these people with this cover-up, then you're part of the cover-up. Too many people have sat back and listened to Mark Lane and wouldn't pay attention to what I said, that he was a part of this cover-up from the word go, and I certainly knew it from 1967 on, but they wanted to believe in Lane, and it's gone on now, and these people are doing the same thing right down the line. These names that I listed to you are doing the same cover-up, and as I say, I sincerely believe that in a few years from now, you're either going to see more demonstrations and the American cities burning because that will be the only alternative, or you'll have General Haig as your president. We're going to that point, and they're working up the ladder, and either you're going to make these changes by exposing these cover-up bastards now, or it's going to be too late. To sum up what they saw as new evidence, I listed what these major researchers thought was good evidence. They saw the way the CIA proceeded without saying a thing about the CIA. They saw new evidence of Jack Ruby without any connections of Ruby to the intelligence community or the assassination teams of the Mayhew higher order, Warren Caroll, H.L. Hunt gang, the oil millionaires. They saw an autopsy wound of Kennedy go lower than the original so what. They still say Lee Harvey Oswald did all the shots. They saw a drawing of an autopsy x-ray which was never seen before. So what? Why can't we see the original? The acoustical evidence is important. The neutron activation analysis of bullets was crap. The confirmation of figure behind the wall was good. But what about that person? The Yuri Nosenko KGB defector that was mentioned by Sylvia Marr is not developed. And I think Nosenko was the man in the KGB that made the arrangements for Lee Harvey Oswald at the Minsk radio factory, and we can go into that some more later. But it wasn't important just to name him as being interesting unless you say why he's interesting. The fact that Oswald's CIA files are missing is an obvious statement. This is the way we're going to cover this thing, and we're not going into it. They didn't cover how Jack Ruby really got into the Dallas jail to kill Lee Harvey Oswald. The scientific tests that Paul Hawke talks about were crappy. And the fact that Oswald met with the mob is not as important as that the mob met with the CIA, and Oswald was the CIA, and they all worked with the Federal Bureau of Investigations. I don't accept Harold Weisberg's just saying it's like the Warren Commission. I think that he could ask for Robert Blakey to be prosecuted for covering up evidence. Their cover-up is still going on, and it's going on the part of these researchers. This is side 2 of tape number 370, January the 5th, 1979. The Assassination Information Bureau asked the various researchers, the 7 researchers, the next question, or this was one of the main questions: what mistakes or omissions did the House Select Committee make? And Jerry Polikoff said Dr. Humes was not asked questions about the autopsy, that was the most serious mistake, that they had Dr. Humes on the stand. He was only on for 10 minutes, and they didn't ask him proper questions about the autopsy of John Kennedy. The second answer to that, Jerry Polikoff had 5 remarks on this. He said they failed to test bullet 399 to see if it could emerge pristine. They ignored Oswald's New Orleans visits with David Ferry, Carlos Bruguiere, and Warren DeBreeze, and they're going to suppress all immunized testimony. And then he went on to say that they went after all the critics, using the umbrella man with an attitude of let's get the critics. Well, I agree that they should have asked Dr. Humes more questions about the autopsy and about a bullet that was handed over by him that was in John Kennedy's body, and another researcher talked about that. And they didn't test bullet 399, that's true. Again, with Oswald's visit to New Orleans, I think as important as visiting with David Ferry and Carlos Bruguiere, who both were with the intelligence community, and Warren DeBreeze at the FBI, I think as important as that would be to go into the area of the Guy Bannister, Albert Osborne, New Orleans connections, also the Clay Shaw connections to the World Trade Mart, and also the Bunge Corporation, which has its headquarters in New Orleans, that was named in the book Were We Controlled as being knowledgeable of the assassination. And that has its headquarters in Argentine, and also would have something to do with the Alexander Zeiger, Argentine, Marina Oswald, Minsk radio connections. I think that that triangle, the Gary Powers U2 part, was completely left out intentionally, because that, again, is getting up the ladder to 7 and 8 if we're going from 1 to 8. Those are the very top of the questions to be answered, the last questions to be answered, or if it was reversed, the bottom line. But building up as a pyramid, those are the areas that were ignored. As far as the Umbrella Man, David Lifton said they made a mistake by using the Umbrella Man to get the critics. But the point is that the Umbrella Man, according to Richard Sprague and other researchers, Richard doesn't believe it was the Umbrella Man. He doesn't believe it was the same umbrella. It has a different handle. It had a different amount of spokes. There was no one to corroborate that he, in fact, was the person that was there. And Richard Sprague feels that they substituted somebody, and it wasn't so much that they were trying to tease all the critics, because Bob Cutler's talked about the Umbrella Man and written books about the Umbrella Man, and they laughed and made that the most comical day when his umbrella pops open and everyone gets hysterical. But the point is that before Senator Church's committee, they demonstrated that an umbrella is a weapon and that it has been used as a weapon. So there wasn't anything funny about that. The same man that talked about the umbrella as a weapon should have been called in, and they should have handled it as seriously as they do other information. What mistakes or omissions did they make? David Lifton said the medical evidence was restricted. Dr. Humes could have told all. I think the omission also has to do with Postmaster Holmes and the reception of that rifle, testifying about the rifle that arrived in Texas, Dallas, Texas. It was supposed to go to Lee Harvey Oswald's box. I think that was a serious omission. I think the medical, Jerry Polikoff mentions it, David Lifton mentions it, Sylvia Marr says. She says the very cursory interrogation of Dr. Humes, I think that's the single most scandalous and outrageous element of the House Select Committee. Well, there was a cursory examination of Gerald Ford before the House Select Committee. He was called before them, and there were documents of his. I have them. The committee knows about them, that when Gerald Ford was on the Warren Commission, he not only was attending the Bilderberger meetings the same time, simultaneously, that were going on in the United States that year as a member of the Bilderbergers, but he also had documents from the very first meeting that Lee Harvey Oswald was in the FBI, and that he also was in the CIA, and he had his CIA number. And I think that's a cursory examination of Gerald Ford, who was there. I think it's equally as scandalous and outrageous as having Dr. Hume. There also was that cursory examination of Marina Oswald, which was outrageous and just as bad as Dr. Hume, because Lee Harvey Oswald didn't have a rifle. He never received it at the post office. And yet in the Warren Commission volumes, volume 10, page 400 and 401, there's testimony or an affidavit signed by Wesley Liebler with Glenn Emmett Smith, dated April the 1st, 1964, 1 year after Lee Harvey Oswald had gone from Dallas, Texas, to New Orleans. And it's about a man named Robert Taylor who worked at a Shell service station just blocks from the Payne's home, Ruth Payne's home. And Marina Oswald moved in with Ruth Payne April 24th, 1963. Lee Harvey Oswald went down to New Orleans April 24th, 1963, and Marina Oswald moved in to the Payne home April 24th, 1963. And Mr. Taylor received a rifle at that home while Oswald was down in New Orleans in exchange for car lubrication. And Mrs. Payne and Marina Oswald were there and gave him this rifle. And he went on to work for the Dallas Police Department. And that man should have been called as a witness. And I think that the most outrageous thing was not the direction of the bullets or the way they even handled Dr. Humes, but the fact that Marina Oswald was on the stand and was never asked the question point blank, did you hand a rifle over to a Mr. Taylor in Irving, Texas from the Shell station? Did you see him? Or to call Mrs. Payne as a witness. But they had Jerry Ford there, they had Marina Oswald, and they did not ask those questions. And a rifle that was sent under the name of A. Heidel was in the Texas School Book Depository, or one similar, and Marina Oswald used that name, forged that name, was caught writing that name, and she was not asked any questions about the rifle. And without finding out if the rifle was planted on Lee Harvey Oswald, it doesn't matter whether the shots, the policeman, Dallas policeman picks up on his tape 4 shots. And this new committee says one shot missed and didn't hit anything. We don't know where it went. It didn't hit anything. 3 shots came from Lee Harvey Oswald. He did all the shooting. He's still guilty. He's still there's a conspiracy, but he's the only man that fired a rifle. And this is not true because he didn't fire the rifle, and the rifle was planted. And it was transferred, and Sylvia Marr is back saying, I think the single most scandalous and outrageous element was the interrogation of Humes, so that you have a clear-cut demarcation of the kind of research that I do. It's Mae Brussell versus Sylvia Marr. I think the most outrageous and scandalous element was, number one, the handling of the neutron tests of the bullets, using different bullets, admitting that the brains of John Kennedy were missing and therefore they couldn't relate what bullets went through that brain to the fragments they were testing, using different bullets than they used in 1964 and not telling where the old ones went and how they got the new ones and why they didn't use the same ones, and not producing the conclusions of the neutron test that J. Edgar Hoover did in 1964, the neutron tests, and the examination of Marina Oswald and of Gerald Ford, to me, were the most scandalous and outrageous elements. And that's where I differ with Sylvia on that subject. The next answer, Sylvia continued to say that they gave Marina difficult moments. They never challenged her regarding the Walker shooting or the attempted shooting of Richard Nixon, and they never questioned how she got FBI agent Hosty's license number or address, which was literally impossible. But if Sylvia Marr wanted to find out how a rifle went from the Payne home where Marina was staying, then the answers would be solved with regard to the Walker shooting, that Lee Harvey Oswald, in fact, hadn't seen the rifle because somebody picked it up at the post office, and there was a lot of evidence that he didn't shoot General Walker. The whole case could have been thrown out if they had stuck with the order by which the rifle changed hands. Harold Weisberg was asked the question, what mistakes or omissions did the House Select Committee make? He said they never addressed the evidence in the body of the case, which is true. But that's like saying the Warren Commission didn't. He said their medical evidence was dishonest. Dr. Bodden was a liar. He said, I will call him a liar, and he can't sue me because he lied about his testimony. And then Harold said the 2 fragments of bullets found by the FBI in the front of the president's car, unless these 2 bullet fragments came from the same bullet, then on this basis alone the total official story is false. Now, Harold Weisberg is right. He's starting at the very beginning, point 1, Dallas, November 22nd, 1963, or when the Warren Commission started in January 1964. If the bullets are not coming from the fragments from the same bullet, then everything else is false. You can't argue with that. But at the same time, this House Select Committee took bullets out of the National Archives, and they tested them, and they admitted that they were bullets that were different than the ones tested before. They admitted the brains were missing and never called the witnesses to find out the chain of command of taking care of the brains of the president that were to be examined for purposes of solving a crime. The John Connolly clothing had been removed and destroyed and dry cleaned. The car is up in Dearborn, Michigan, and they didn't ask how in the hell it got to the basement of the Ford Motor Company. It was Henry Ford who funded Adolf Hitler, one of the first Americans to be overtly responsible for helping Adolf Hitler create his army and his tanks and cars and so forth. The car is in the basement up there, and nobody asked how it got there or why it's there. And the location of bullet 399 was never identified, even this committee. The capability of doing the damage was not tested, as mentioned before. So we have all of this information, but we've had this since 1964, and I think that they should be not reiterating as if they're starting like newborn babies with a new committee. They're doing the same work they did back in 64. It's like Mark Lane going to the Boston Conference in 75 and setting up a blackboard and a pointer and giving a talk about Helen Markham and the grassy knoll. The same talk he gave at Beverly Hills High School in 1964 he's giving in 75. There has to be something wrong with these people. There absolutely has to be. And if you meet them and confront them, you'll find out. If you ever get a chance to correspond and say what gives with you people, they should be outraged at the job that G. Robert Blakey did and Chairman Stokes, but they're all very cozy and they're very satisfied, and they can continue to do some more books and articles without ever letting you get to the surface until you have General Haig as President of the United States, and then you won't be able to ask these questions. I assure you, you won't be able to ask these questions. Now, Harold Weisberg talks about fragments that were recovered, copper-jacketed fragments, and they were numbered Q2 and Q3, but he says Q3 had no lead core material, and Dr. Gunn is an expert on copper jacket material and limited his questions. He's right, we should stick with the evidence, but he got along quite genially or quite smugly and just said, well, they're not doing anything. But that doesn't solve the problem. Paul Hawk was asked, what mistakes or omissions did the House Select Committee make? And his first suggestion was that they failed to press Dr. Hume on the autopsy of John Kennedy. And then his second suggestion, which I hardly agree with, but which Paul Hawk would never sit down with me and develop at any point, is they failed to pay attention to the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald was framed. Now, we know Lee Harvey Oswald was framed when you see the picture of him with holding the rifle in the shadows, and when Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested, he said, I'm a patsy. And Paul Hawk says there's circumstantial case against Lee Harvey Oswald, and that's true. They failed to show how he was framed, and there is circumstantial case that they've developed against him. In volume 22, page 376, there's a note in Seth Canner's notebook that the first tip-off that the rifle came from Klein's in Chicago, the mail-order rifle, was from a North Carolina preacher who called up and said, go to Klein's in Chicago. Again, the preacher, the church, the World Council of Churches, the Torbett document talks about the church being one of a 5-part prong of Permindex. A preacher from North Carolina says, get the rifle, it's at Klein's in Chicago. Why didn't they look into the tip-off of the gun? Why didn't they identify where the bullet was found in Parkland Hospital before the doctors go into the long story of how this bullet could go through John Kennedy and John Connally and then end with the wrist of John Connally, and they didn't follow it through to the thigh and the stretcher? Why didn't they find out whose stretcher it was? Because if bullet 399 wasn't tested and couldn't do the shots, and if it was found on John Kennedy's stretcher or some stranger's stretcher, not John Connally's, then all the medical evidence is a bunch of bull crap. Should I say bullshit? That's all it is. I can say it because we're off the air. These are private tapes. Excuse me. The planted negatives that were found, the picture of Lee Harvey Oswald holding a rifle. See, Paul Hawk says that Oswald was framed and they didn't pay attention to it. And then on the other hand, he says they did an excellent job with their scientific evidence. What about that picture of Lee Harvey Oswald holding the rifle? What about the testing of bullet 399? What about the testing the weapons of killing Officer Tippett? The bullet holes in Tippett didn't match the pistol that Lee Harvey Oswald had. Why not press the handwriting experts and do some scientific work on the handwriting that ordered the gun at Klein's or the pistol out in California, and Marina Oswald using the signature of Heidel, or going into the use of the doubles of Lee Harvey Oswald, totally left out of this investigation of the people impersonating Lee Harvey Oswald. The CIA has voice prints of Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico at the Cuban embassy that they wouldn't produce, that would show it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald's voice, probably that the person there that was setting up the storm wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. So what Paul Hawk says, the AIB, is that they failed to pay attention to the fact that Oswald was framed and that there was a circumstantial case, but on the other hand, he says their scientific evidence was excellent. And yet, if they used the scientific evidence, it would prove beyond any doubt that Oswald was framed, and yet he leaves that open. And then Paul Hawk said they left out the Dallas involvement of how Ruby got into the basement. Well, I don't think it's so important whether Jack Ruby went down the ramp or whether he came in a door that was supposed to be investigated that nobody investigated, or whether he got out of a green car that was parked in the basement The important thing is, who is Jack Ruby? Jack Ruby's contacts, as I say, to Bertha Cheek and Earlene Roberts, Ruby's contacts to the Dallas Police Department, his contacts to Warren Caroll of the CIA, Connie Trammell, the Young Americans for Freedom, the German marksmen that were brought over here from Germany. And I'll have to do one whole tape for you on that. And his contacts with H.L. Hunt. And also Billy Del Mar, the hypnotist in the nightclub. At the time, just before John Kennedy was killed, Ruby closed his club when Kennedy was killed. Billy Del Mar fled and was never interviewed. And Jack Ruby had been hypnotized and told he would be a hero by the CIA and by Warren Caroll, once in a lifetime, be a hero. He thought he would be great if he killed this person who had killed President Kennedy. And also he knew David Ferry, the hypnotist, who also was an expert in doing scientific work on experiments with cancer and mice and cancer. And you know, Jack Ruby died of that 3-week cancer, although they had probably developed in better laboratories than David Ferry's apartment. But the point is that they left out, according to Paul Hawke, the Dallas involvement of how Ruby got in the basement. And where Mae Brussell differs with Paul Hawke is that they left out all of the links of Ruby. In the past, he was an informer for the FBI, the House Security Committee, when Richard Nixon was running the House on American activities. He worked with the CIA, his connections in Las Vegas with organized crime that worked directly with the Central Intelligence Agency. That's what they left out, not how it got in the damn basement. Pardon me again, but it really disgusts me how primitive these people are and pass themselves off as experts. It's not how he got into the basement. It's the story of who Jack Ruby was and who he knew and how he was used, and then how he died and what he tried to tell the Warren Commission, and they passed him off as being an idiot. Bernard Fensterwald was asked what mistakes or omissions did the House Select Committee make, and he said there are two things. They permitted the FBI and CIA to dictate who they could have on their staff, and they did not use their subpoena power towards the executive branch. Now, there's a contradiction here, and this is an interesting comment coming from Bernard Fensterwald, who works directly with the CIA. He was James McCord's attorney, and he's now representing another family from the CIA, the widow of the gentleman that was found drowned. She now believes it was a double. He's the attorney for that case. Works with the CIA all of his life. There's a contradiction here. A, if Fensterwald's right that the FBI and CIA dictated who they could have on their staff, then why in the heck would they use their subpoena power towards anybody? The purpose of their dictating is to control the witnesses. Once you have your staff set up, it goes without saying that they control the witnesses. So that's a contradiction to say that they could dictate who the staff was and then expect them to subpoena anybody. And then at the last minute, he says they made a mistake by canceling Sylvia Duran's testimony. This is what he says. Well, Mae Brussell differs with Bernard Fensterwald about the omissions they made. I again say, what about Robert Mayhew from the Howard Hughes organization that had been the hidden branch, the open defense intelligence CIA branch of the CIA since 1947 when it started, but the hidden CIA assassination since 1950 when Mayhew made, 1960 rather, when he made his overt greetings from the intelligence community, from the Defense Department and intelligence community to organized crime. Robert Mayhew is alive and could be called. What about the omission of Ruth Payne? Because, number one, there was a rifle at her home. There were allegations of a rifle at her home. And also, she is the woman that called Roy Truly and got the job for Lee Harvey Oswald in the Texas School Book Depository and placed him in the building. I'm sure that he was part of the conspiracy. He wasn't innocent, and he expected to be a decoy and to be released, and he was framed. But if Ruth Payne was asked the question, did Lee Harvey Oswald get in your white station wagon when a car honk that Sheriff Craig said happened, then Lee Harvey Oswald is alive and the double is dead. And that omission goes into not exhuming that body that I've talked about, that grave in Texas, where the Warren Commission said we have to destroy that body and cremate it because the nation can't stand another shock. Ruth Paine should have been asked about the rifle. She should have been asked about the station wagon, and she should have been asked under oath and been given a sentence of perjury if she lied, because they could also exhume the body. They should have called General Walker in and asked him about his assistant, Mr. Duff, who went to New Orleans, and that's very important. The man that disappeared in Oklahoma, General Walker should have been asked, was Jack Ruby at your home at any time? Can you tell us anything about Jack Ruby? And they should have had Ruth de Mohrenschildt, who claims that her husband was a Nazi agent, that he worked for the CIA, because she said she saw a rifle in the home of Leah Marina Oswald, and that rifle, because it was in a closet, doesn't necessarily mean it was fired at all. But she saw a rifle that Marina showed her in April, before the de Mohrenschildts went to Haiti and before Lee Harvey Oswald went to New Orleans, because that could have been the rifle that went with Marina to Ruth Paine's house. It is absolutely verified that the rifle couldn't have gone from Dallas to New Orleans in the baggage that Lee Harvey Oswald had in the size. It couldn't have gone from New Orleans to Mexico. It didn't go back with Marina's possessions from New Orleans to Dallas. So the point is that Marina Oswald, in April of '63, Easter time, showed Jean de Mohrenschildt one evening in the back bedroom. She took her in there. It was late at night, and the de Mohrenschildt had wakened them up. She took her, opened a door. There was a closet. This is the only living person who's supposed to have seen a rifle that could have belonged to Lee Harvey Oswald anywhere near Lee Harvey Oswald from the time he left the Soviet Union, where Marina said he belonged to a rifle club. And this woman, Jean de Mohrenschildt, was not allowed to talk about, because if Marina got it from a post office box and had it in a closet, and Mrs. Paine picked her up on April 24th, the rifle could go to Paine's house with Marina, where Mr. Taylor picked it up, and that was the rifle that was found behind the boxes at the Texas School Book Depository, without palm prints, without fingerprints, without any link, hair or fiber, to Lee Harvey Oswald, and his paraffin tests were negative. These were the things that should have happened. So when Fensterwald says that they canceled Sylvia Duran's testimony, we're back again at the Warren Commission level, at a very unsophisticated level. The things I'm talking about are things that I cross-filed and researched after the Warren Commission was over, and spent 8 years cross-filing those 26 volumes. They could have called Roy Truly as a witness, because he had German Mausers in the Texas School Book Depository, and Lee Harvey Oswald talked about them, and that's in the 26 volumes. And also I mentioned it in the People's Almanac, the new volume 2 of People's Almanac. Lee Harvey Oswald talked about other Mausers in the building, and the first gun was supposed to be a German Mauser. Roy Truly is alive, and he wasn't called. And Eugene Braden of organized crime, who was at the Dow Tex building, who was at Dealey Plaza, did not have public testimony. See, these people are being interviewed about the public testimony because we don't know what went on behind. And for all I know, Warren Caroll of the CIA, who wrote Lifeline for H.L. Hunt, that was partly played by the Rockefellers, that newspaper that went out called Lifeline. The script of Lifeline was on the car of Jack Ruby's, the Be a Hero, Once in a Lifetime, Be a Hero. Warren Caroll worked for the CIA and had the papers that were telling Jack Ruby to be a hero and take this great courageous stand, stick out once and do something of great courage. Warren Caroll wasn't called. Now, Division 5 of the FBI, that's written up in the Torbett document, headed by William Sullivan, of course, they must have an intelligence branch now. William Sullivan died just when the committee was doing their work. I'm sure he wouldn't have been called. And Albert Osborne is dead. But somebody must know about Division 5 of the FBI, about the counterintelligence school, the school for assassins down in Oaxaca, Mexico, and somebody from there should have been called. They asked Caroll Oglesby, what mistakes or omissions did the House Select Committee make? And Caroll Oglesby said their mandate was to review the record. Its purpose was not necessarily to find the final truth in solving the case. Its purpose was not to defend the official theory of the lone assassin. Blakey started out this at the outset with only one side as a prosecutor against Lee Harvey Oswald, and Chairman Stokes as the chairman owed it to the Congress and the country to offer Oswald's defense. Now, what these people have done that I've named for you from called Seven Serious Critics, what they've done with the Assassination Information Bureau that Penn Jones has referred to as being part of the Central Intelligence Agency themselves, they've given you the most elementary, infantile conclusions that maybe, if you don't know anything about assassinations before and not much about the Warren Commission hearings, and the Warren Report is out of print and the 26 volumes are not available and you don't have the time and patience to read them, they give you the most superficial cover-up the second time around. And for somebody who's done the amount of work that other people like myself have done, or just speaking for Mae Brussell, it's offensive to see these people personally, to meet them, to hear what they say, and to see the way they cover up. It's true that Blakey, at the outset, started as a prosecutor against Oswald, but they all knew that. Every single one of these people knew within a week when Blakey was hired what he was going to be. And they should have gone to the Justice Department or Congress and said, stop the money, stop the hearings. I was saying on tapes and radio all along, it was nothing but a cover-up. It should never be started with these people doing the investigation. They never proved that Lee Harvey Oswald shot anybody. They never produced the original autopsy x-rays. They never proved that the bullet went through John Connolly to that stretcher or could have gone from his thigh to the stretcher. They never proved that the bullets that they had were consistent with the bullets, fragments that came out of Lee Harvey Oswald's weapon. They never explained why they used different bullets. They never convinced the public at large that the fatal headshot came from the behind and not over from the front. And they never convinced in this work that Oswald fired a rifle as fast as they said he did. They were able to speed up this rifle now and make it work faster than it did before. And this was apologized by one of the critics by saying it's been tested so many times it works faster. The fault with the second layer cover-up goes into who was selected to do the work and the apologists that were their advisors, who sit back and now just come out with these asinine explanations of the errors of the committee. The errors of the committee go beyond Dr. Hume. They go beyond even this tape of the police recording, because they still end up with Lee Harvey Oswald doing the shots and the other bullet going astray. They say there was a second gunman at the fence, but he missed. Believe me, if they went to the bother of having a conspiracy with a second gunman there, he was an expert marksman. He was able to get away from the Dallas police, the Secret Service, the FBI, not be apprehended, not being recognized. He knew how to shoot, and he certainly didn't miss. And if he shot, where did it go? He didn't miss. He hit the head of John Kennedy. And these people think it's a great feat that the sound shows 4 bullets, instead of being angered at the story that the fatal headshot came from behind. Many of you have that position paper I wrote September 17th, 1976, 2 years ago, when the House Select Committee was going to do their investigations. And I predicted many of the errors that they have been making and made, and I knew 2 years ago clearly where they were going. There was no excuse for what they were going to do. In 1976, it was obvious. And I said that new panel that's going to be selected is already bowing down to the same pressures the Warren Commission had. This gives you a very brief analysis of the difference between where this is going and who's covering up, and how Mae Brussell feels as against these other critics who are speaking up for the critical community, and they certainly are not speaking up for me. It's very important to ask why in 1978 they still hold such primitive and elementary conclusions when there's so much more information leading to the conspirators, and as I say, our time is running out.